before the dragons, before the Freehold, before a single Valyrian ever tamed a flame in the sky, there was an empire built on brick, blood, and chains. It ruled half a continent when Valyria was nothing but a scatter of sheep-herding villages on a smoking peninsula. It built cities so vast that travelers claimed you could walk for a full day and never leave its walls. It worshipped a god that demanded blood, and it fed that god with the bodies of the people it conquered. And then, it was erased. Not conquered. Not absorbed. Erased. Burned so completely that the ground itself was cursed, and for 1,000 years afterward, nothing would grow there again. This is the story of Old Ghis, the forgotten superpower that came before Valyria, the empire that taught the world how to make slaves out of men, and the war that ended it so violently that its memory survives only in the broken, half-understood ruins of the cities we now call Slavers' Bay. If you've ever wondered where Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen actually came from, if you've ever wondered why Missandei speaks a strange, ancient tongue, or why the Unsullied march the way they march, the answer starts here, in an empire that history tried to erase and almost succeeded. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Valyrians feared one thing in this world, and one thing only, the ghost of the empire they destroyed. Let's begin. To understand Old Ghis, you first have to forget everything you know about the world of Westeros and Essos as it exists in the stories most people are familiar with. Forget dragons ruling the skies. Forget the Iron Throne. Forget Valyria as the greatest civilization to ever exist. None of that has happened yet. We are going back roughly 5,000 years before the events most fans are familiar with. Long before Aegon the Conqueror, long before the Doom, long before Valyria even became an empire worth mentioning. At this point in history, the eastern continent of Essos is a patchwork of scattered peoples. Far to the north, the nomadic horse lords who would one day become the Dothraki are little more than wandering clans. To the west, across the narrow sea, the continent of Westeros is ruled by the first men and, before them, the mysterious children of the forest. Magic is still strong in the world. The concept of a unified empire, a single power dominating an entire region, barely exists anywhere. Except in one place. On a peninsula in southern Essos, in the region we now call Slavers' Bay, a civilization is already old. Already powerful. Already an empire in every sense of the word, complete with god-kings, standing armies, monumental architecture, and an economy built entirely on the buying and selling of human beings. This is Ghis. And by the time most other cultures in this story are still learning how to farm, Ghis is already conquering neighbors, building brick cities the size of small nations, and worshipping gods with fire and blood. It's easy to forget, when you're only familiar with the version of this world dominated by Valyrian dragonlords, that the Valyrians were the new kids on the block. Ghis was the old power. The established order. The empire that had already been ruling this corner of the world for longer than anyone could remember. And that matters, because everything that happens later, the wars, the destruction, the curse on the land, only makes sense once you understand that Valyria wasn't fighting some primitive tribal society. It was fighting the region's original superpower. An empire that had every reason to believe it was untouchable. At the heart of the Ghiscari Empire stood its capital, the city known simply as Ghis, sometimes called Old Ghis to distinguish it from the empire itself. Where Valyria would later be remembered for soaring towers of dragonstone and volcanic rock, Ghis was remembered for something far more grounded, quite literally, brick. Endless, monumental brick. The Ghiscari were master brickmakers, and they used that skill to build a capital so enormous that later chroniclers struggled to describe its true size without sounding like they were exaggerating. Accounts passed down through the ages describe walls thick enough to ride 3 chariots abreast along their top. They describe temples and slave markets built on a scale that dwarfed anything else in the known world at the time. They describe a city so large that some structures within it were themselves the size of entire towns. This wasn't just a city. It was a statement. A physical declaration that Ghis was the center of civilization, and everything beyond its walls existed to serve it. And that's really the key to understanding the entire Ghiscari worldview. Everything beyond Ghis existed to serve Ghis. The empire that grew out of this city didn't expand through trade agreements or diplomacy. It expanded the way most ancient empires expanded, through conquest. But the Ghiscari had a particular specialty, one that would define their civilization for thousands of years and would eventually become their most lasting, most horrifying legacy. They didn't just conquer people. They enslaved them. Systematically. Industrially. On a scale that turned human bondage into the actual economic engine of an empire. Where other ancient societies practiced slavery as one institution among many, the Ghiscari perfected it as the institution, the organizing principle of their entire civilization. Conquered peoples weren't simply subjugated or taxed. They were catalogued, priced, and sold. Entire populations became commodities. Cities that Ghis conquered weren't turned into provinces so much as into supply lines for the slave markets back home. This is the origin point of something that will echo for thousands of years down the timeline of this world, because the cities that rise from the ashes of the Ghiscari Empire much later, Astapor, Yunkai, Meereen, the cities of slavers, that become infamous in later history, didn't invent the slave trade. They inherited it. They are the descendants, culturally and literally, of an empire that had already spent millennia perfecting the business of human bondage before Valyria ever existed. Understanding that lineage changes how you see everything that comes later. When later conquerors arrive in Slaver's Bay and find slave markets stretching for miles, they're not looking at some new invention. They're looking at the final, degraded remnant of an imperial tradition that stretches back to the very beginning of civilization in this part of the world. No empire survives on economics alone. It needs a story, a justification, a god. The Ghiscari had one, and it was as ruthless as the empire it inspired. Ghiscari religion centered on gods that demanded blood sacrifice as a matter of course. This wasn't a fringe cult practice or an occasional ritual. It was mainstream, central, and expected. The Ghiscari believed that their gods required blood to remain strong, and so blood was given, regularly and without much ceremony of guilt. This mattered enormously for how the empire treated the people it conquered. If your gods demand sacrifice, and you have an enormous captive population of enslaved people at your disposal, the logic writes itself. Conquered peoples weren't just labor. In Ghiscari religious practice, they were also a resource for appeasing the divine. It's a chilling detail, but it's an important one, because it explains something that might otherwise seem confusing: why the Ghiscari treated conquest and slavery not as a moral problem to be rationalized, but as a natural, almost sacred right. Their religion didn't just permit their empire's brutality, it demanded it. This is also where we start to see hints of a darker connection, one that scholars in this world have long debated. There are unsettling similarities between certain Ghiscari religious practices and the blood magic later associated with other, even more feared traditions in this world's history. Some maesters and scholars have speculated that the roots of certain dark magical practices we hear about far later in history, practices associated with fear, blood, and forbidden power, may trace back to influences that first took hold in the Ghiscari religious tradition, or which the Ghiscari themselves absorbed from even older, forgotten sources. We don't know for certain. Much of Ghiscari religious practice was lost when the empire itself was destroyed. But the fragments that survive paint a picture of a civilization that saw cruelty not as a byproduct of empire, but as a form of worship. Combine that with an economy built on slavery, and you get a civilization perfectly engineered to expand ruthlessly, for centuries, without ever needing to ask itself whether it should. By the time other regions of the world were still developing their earliest kingdoms, Ghis had already grown into something approaching a true hegemon of the region we now know as southern Essos. The empire's territory extended along the coastline and inland, absorbing smaller city-states and tribal confederations one after another. Its armies were large, disciplined, and, this is important, increasingly built around a very particular kind of soldier, the slave soldier. This is one of the most consequential legacies of the entire Ghiscari civilization, because it's directly responsible for something that shows up much later in the world's history and becomes globally infamous: the concept of an army made entirely of trained, enslaved warriors, stripped of personal identity and molded into perfect, obedient instruments of war. Long before the more famous slave soldier traditions of later eras. The ones that eventually produced the disciplined, terrifying legions associated with the slave cities of a much later age, Ghis was already experimenting with the basic idea. Take conquered or purchased people. Break them, physically and psychologically. Train them from a young age. Strip away their names, their families, their pasts. Rebuild them as a weapon with no loyalty except to the empire that owns them. It's a horrifying process, and it's also, militarily speaking, devastatingly effective. Soldiers with no fear of death because they have nothing left to live for outside of their function are famously difficult to break in battle. And Ghis used exactly this kind of army to expand its borders further and further, decade after decade, century after century. At its height, the Ghiscari Empire likely controlled a significant portion of what would later be called Slaver's Bay and the surrounding regions. A sprawling territory held together by military force, slave labor, religious ideology, and the sheer psychological weight of Ghis's reputation. Neighboring peoples didn't just fear Ghis. They had grown up assuming Ghis was simply how the world worked. A permanent fixture, like the sun or the sea. Nobody, least of all the Ghiscari themselves, imagined that anything could ever threaten that permanence. Which brings us to the peninsula in the west. The one nobody was paying attention to. The one where a small, unremarkable group of exiles and shepherds had settled among smoking mountains, on a strip of land called Valyria. Here's something that tends to surprise people when they first learn the real order of events in this world's history. Valyria did not start out as a threat to anyone. For a very long time, it wasn't even a rival. It was an afterthought. The early Valyrians were, by most accounts, a relatively unremarkable people occupying the Valyrian Peninsula, a volcanic, mountainous region dominated by a chain of 14 volcanoes collectively known as the 14 Fires. They were shepherds. Herders. A modest population scraping out an existence on land that was, frankly, more dangerous than valuable, given the constant volcanic activity. What set them apart? The detail that changes literally everything about the future of this entire world, is that the mountains surrounding Valyria happened to be home to dragons. At some point, long before recorded history really pins it down with certainty, the Valyrians learned to tame these dragons. Not domesticate them like cattle, but forge something closer to a partnership, a bond that allowed a rider to direct a dragon's terrifying power in battle. This single development is the hinge point on which the entire future of this world turns. But here's the thing, taming dragons didn't make Valyria a superpower overnight. For a long stretch of time, Valyria remained a comparatively minor regional power, its dragon riders more useful for defending their home peninsula and putting down local rivals than for any kind of large-scale imperial conquest. Meanwhile, across the water and around the coastline, Ghis continued doing what Ghis had always done. Expanding, conquering, enslaving, growing richer and more powerful with each passing generation, utterly unbothered by rumors of some shepherd people with tamed lizards on a smoking rock far to the west. If you had asked anyone living in this era which of these two powers was destined to dominate the continent, the answer would have been obvious. Ghis was the empire. Valyria was a curiosity. That confidence would turn out to be Ghis's fatal mistake. As Valyria's power slowly grew, as its dragon-riding houses consolidated control over the peninsula and began looking outward for the first time, it was probably inevitable that it would eventually run into the dominant regional power already sitting on its doorstep. Ghis, for its part, likely saw the growing Valyrian domain the way it saw every other neighboring territory, as a future province. A region that hadn't been conquered yet, simply because Ghis hadn't gotten around to it. This is the critical psychological error that defines the entire coming conflict. Ghis had spent so many centuries as the unchallenged regional hegemon that it fundamentally failed to update its understanding of what Valyria actually was. It saw dragon riders and thought, interesting curiosity, dangerous in small numbers, but ultimately just another army to be absorbed or crushed, the same as every other army Ghis had crushed for 1,000 years. What Ghis failed to grasp, what nobody in the world had yet fully grasped, because nothing like it had existed before, was that dragons weren't just a stronger version of cavalry or war elephants. They were something categorically different. A weapon that essentially broke the existing rules of ancient warfare. An army of slave soldiers, no matter how well trained, no matter how numerous, no matter how disciplined, had never in its history faced an enemy that could simply fly over its formations and incinerate them from above, safely out of reach of spears, arrows, and shields. Ghis was about to learn that lesson in the most violent way imaginable. What followed was not a single war, but a long, grinding series of conflicts stretched across centuries. A sequence of brutal confrontations that history remembers as the Ghiscari Wars, sometimes called the 5 wars fought between Ghis and Valyria across multiple generations. The exact details of the earliest conflicts between Ghis and Valyria are hazy, buried under thousands of years of myth, propaganda, and lost records. But the broad shape of the story survives, and it's a story of escalating disbelief on the Ghiscari side. In the earliest clashes, Ghis almost certainly treated Valyria the way it treated any other rebellious frontier territory, sending conventional armies to put down what it assumed was a manageable, if unusually stubborn, local power. And in those early wars, Ghis probably won more often than it lost, or at least fought Valyria to something resembling a standstill. Valyria's dragon forces, in these early centuries, were smaller in number and less battle-tested on the scale of full imperial warfare. Ghis had numbers, resources, fortified cities, and centuries of military tradition on its side. But every war fought, even the ones Ghis won or drew, taught the Valyrians something new about how to use their dragons more effectively at scale. Every generation of conflict pushed Valyria to breed more dragons, train more riders, and refine the tactics of aerial warfare against massed infantry and fortified positions. Ghis, meanwhile, kept doing what had always worked before. More slave soldiers. More walls. More of the same imperial playbook that had crushed every other enemy for 1,000 years. This is one of the most important patterns to understand in the entire conflict. Valyria adapted. Ghis, for a very long time, did not. And in any prolonged conflict between two civilizations, the one that adapts faster almost always wins eventually, no matter how strong the other side's starting position. By the time the later wars in the sequence rolled around, the balance of power had shifted dramatically, even though most people living through it, especially on the Ghiscari side, probably didn't fully register just how much the ground had moved beneath them. The last of the Ghiscari Wars is the one that ends the story of Old Ghis forever, and it's worth slowing down here, because this is the climax of everything we've been building toward. By this point in the conflict, Valyria's dragon forces had grown to a scale that no army in the known world could realistically hope to counter through conventional means. Ghis still relying fundamentally on the same imperial model that had built and sustained it for millennia. Vast slave armies, fortified brick cities, sheer weight of numbers, marched to meet Valyria one final time. What followed was less a battle and more an extermination. Valyrian dragons descended on Ghiscari forces and cities alike, unleashing fire on a scale that ancient chroniclers struggled to describe without sounding like they were exaggerating for effect. Cities that had stood for thousands of years, walls thick enough to march chariots along their tops, brick structures that had seemed permanent, eternal, unshakable, all of it burned. And it wasn't just military targets. This is the detail that separates the fall of Ghis from an ordinary military defeat. Valyria didn't simply defeat the Ghiscari army and negotiate terms. It annihilated the civilization at its root. The capital city of Ghis itself. The ancient heart of the empire, the city of brick and blood that had once been the largest and most powerful in the known world, was burned so thoroughly, so completely, that according to the legends that survive, the very ground beneath it was left cursed. The stories say that for centuries afterward, nothing would grow on the site where the city once stood. The earth itself had been poisoned by fire and dragon flame to the point where it could no longer sustain life. Whether that detail is literal fact or the kind of mythic exaggeration that attaches itself to catastrophic historical events, the underlying truth is the same either way. Valyria didn't just want to defeat Ghis. It wanted to erase it. To make an example so total, so absolute, that no other power in the world would ever again make the mistake of underestimating Valyrian dragonfire. And it worked. The empire that had ruled its corner of the world for longer than anyone could remember, the civilization that had once looked at Valyria as an insignificant curiosity not worth serious concern, ceased to exist. Its cities were left in ruins. Its people were scattered, killed, or absorbed. Its capital became a dead zone, a cursed ruin that later travelers would speak of only in whispers, if they spoke of it at all. This is, historically speaking, the true birth of the Valyrian Freehold as the dominant power of the known world. Not the taming of dragons, that had happened generations earlier. The true turning point is the total destruction of Ghis. That's the moment Valyria proves, decisively and terrifyingly, that no existing power structure in the world can stand against it. Every other kingdom, city-state, and empire that. Here's the story of what happened to Ghis learns the same lesson: submit, ally, or be erased. But here's the thing about empires that last for thousands of years. They're never quite as easy to erase as their destroyers hope. Even after the capital fell and the heartland was cursed, Ghiscari culture didn't vanish from the world entirely. Pockets of Ghiscari civilization survived on the fringes of the old empire, particularly in the region we now call Slaver's Bay. Cities that had once been provinces or client states of the Ghiscari Empire, cities that carried Ghiscari blood, Ghiscari language, and Ghiscari traditions, endured, even as the central power that once bound them together turned to ash. Over the centuries and millennia that followed, these surviving Ghiscari cities rebuilt themselves, evolved, and eventually re-emerged as independent slave-trading city-states in their own right. This is the direct, unbroken line connecting Old Ghis to the cities that appear far later in this world's more familiar history. Astapor, famous for its brutal training of slave soldiers into elite fighting units. Yunkai, the city of spice and slaves. And Meereen, the greatest and most infamous of the three, its pyramids echoing the monumental brick architecture of the original Ghiscari capital. These cities aren't just geographically close to where Old Ghis once stood. They are its cultural and, in many cases, its literal descendants, inheritors of a slaving tradition that stretches back not decades or centuries, but thousands of years, to an empire that existed before Valyria ever burned a single village. Even the language spoken by figures who become notable much later in this world's history, figures whose native tongue is described as an old, difficult, tonal language distinct from the more common trade languages of the era, is a direct descendant of the ancient Ghiscari tongue, passed down and evolved over millennia of continuous use in the region. And the brutal military tradition that Old Ghis pioneered, taking conquered or purchased people and rebuilding them from childhood into obedient, faceless soldiers stripped of identity, echoes forward across thousands of years into the training practices later associated with the most feared slave soldiers in the known world. The methods change in their details over the centuries, but the underlying philosophy, break the person, build the weapon, traces directly back to innovations Ghis pioneered while it still ruled as an unchallenged empire. In a very real sense, the ghost of Old Ghis never actually left the world. It just went underground, scattered into smaller, weaker fragments, waiting millennia for history to circle back around to it. And when it finally does, when later conquerors arrive in Slaver's Bay and tear down the slave markets that Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen had built on the ruins of the old Ghiscari system, there's a poetic symmetry to it that's easy to miss if you don't know the deeper history. In a way, that later moment of liberation is the final chapter of a story that began thousands of years earlier, in the blood-soaked temples and brick capital of an empire that once believed it would rule forever. So why does any of this matter? Why should a viewer today care about an empire that was destroyed thousands of years before the main events most people are familiar with even begin? Because Old Ghis isn't just background lore. It's the origin story for two of the most important forces shaping the entire world in this saga: the culture of slavery that defined Slaver's Bay for thousands of years afterward, and the terrifying precedent of what Valyrian dragonfire is actually capable of when unleashed without mercy. Every time a later story reminds us how catastrophic Valyria's power really was, it's drawing on the memory, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just structurally, of what happened to Ghis. Every time we see the brutal, dehumanizing training of slave soldiers in Slaver's Bay, we're looking at a system whose roots run back through millennia of Ghiscari tradition, not something invented in isolation by a handful of later slave cities. Old Ghis is the empire that taught the world two of its darkest lessons: that human beings can be turned into a commodity on an industrial scale, and that no civilization, no matter how ancient, how vast, or how confident in its own permanence, is ever truly safe from something new and unimaginable arriving over the horizon. It rose for thousands of years. It fell in a matter of years, maybe less. And its shadow, in language, in culture, in the brutal slave markets that rise again and again from its ashes, never really stopped falling across the rest of the world's history. That's the story of Old Ghis, the empire that ruled before Valyria, the civilization that perfected slavery on an industrial scale, and the power whose total destruction became the founding myth of the very Freehold that would go on to dominate the known world for thousands of years afterward. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten history behind the world's most famous slave cities, let me know in the comments. And tell me which lost empire or forgotten war you want covered next. Was it the doom of Valyria? The Rhoynish Wars? The Century of Blood? Drop your suggestions below. If this video helped you understand a piece of the lore you never knew existed, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.